Hello, everyone. It's Larry Kotlikoff back with Economics Matters, the podcast. I'm delighted, truly delighted to have Paulo Nogueira Batista. If I didn't say that right, Paulo, you're going to correct me, okay? New Jersey has ruined my ability to pronounce foreign languages, but anyway, and names. Anyway, I'm delighted to have Paulo with us. He's arguably the top economist in Brazil. And we, in this podcast, have gone around the world to talk about European economies and what's going on in Chile and Argentina and other parts of the world, but not Brazil. And Brazil is a very important economy. But we're not going to focus primarily on Brazil today. We're going to talk about current geopolitical issues, particularly the alleged coup in, well, the abduction of Maduro in Venezuela and the alleged running of Venezuela and confiscation of the oil of Venezuela and how that, your Paulo's views on this. But I wanted to stop for a moment and have you just give a brief background, a brief bio to everybody, because it'll take me longer than you can produce.
Let me just focus on the recent things. I was Brazilian executive director at the IMF in Washington. Great. And I moved from Washington to Shanghai to be one of the founding members of the BRICS New Development Bank. And after 2.5 years in Shanghai, I came back to Brazil, where I worked mainly as a researcher and also as a participant in public debates in Brazil and outside Brazil.
And in terms of your education in economics, it was at Católica University in Rio.
That's right.
And then LSE, right?
LSE, yeah. Right.
Yeah. And just so everybody knows, the IMF is a very important institution that is involved with both developing and developed countries and overseeing their fiscal and monetary affairs and bailing them out when they get into trouble under certain conditions. So it's really an important post-war. It was set up after World War II alongside the World Bank. And to be the executive director for about 8 years is a very important role. Paulo represented Brazil, but many other countries in South America during this period. So, and he had a big influence on the IMF's operations and changes in the way they were operating, and certainly getting the developing world to have more influence on what was happening at the IMF, right?
I would say that my influence was not that big because the developing countries, the emerging market and developing countries do not have enough voting power in the IMF to become large influencers of the actual course of events. In fact, I think the IMF has two faces. One face is technical, economic. You have a team of economists, well prepared. They investigate, they do surveillance, they do conditionality for lending, they supervise economies in detail, in rather extensive detail for some countries, the larger ones. But the IMF is not only technical, it's also political. And in a bad sense of the word, because the West, the US and Europeans, chiefly in the case of the IMF, they use the IMF as well as the World Bank as a political instrument to favor countries they like, that cooperate with them, and to discriminate against those that don't. So a significant part of my 8 years in the IMF was an attempt, together with other directors that represented emerging market and developing countries, was an attempt to change this, to make the institution look more like the 21st century. We had some success initially, let me tell you, because of the crisis in the US financial system that broke out in 2008. The US and Europe needed international support through the IMF, including, and there was more willingness to listen to us. We did make some progress. But after the crisis subsided in the US and Europe, we were back to the situation where any fundamental changes were simply stonewall. To give you an idea of how serious that is, in the last 15 years, absolutely nothing has happened of consequence in terms of IMF governance. And this is no accident. It's not bureaucratic inertia. It's political willingness, unwillingness on the part of the United States and Europeans to contemplate anything that would relax their hold on the institution. So there's an increasing discrepancy in the institution, in how it is structured, and the reality of the 21st century. We wanted to move the IMF into the 21st century, but the US and the Europeans are determined to keep it in the 20th century.
Okay, so if you had, let's say, a different structure, the structure that you would, prefer, what would the behavior of the IMF, how would it have differed in recent decades? What do you see the IMF doing wrong? What should it be doing?
Well, for example, the IMF, as well as the World Bank, they operate in the following fashion. If there's a country in need of support, financial balance of payments, this country will receive support, sometimes without many questions being asked, provided that it is geopolitically aligned with the West, with the United States and Europe. On the other hand, a country may be in dire need of support, balance of payment support, fiscal support, and it will have no access to any support from the fund or the World Bank if it is not aligned with the West, geopolitically speaking. So, for example, Ukraine gets all it wants from these two Bretton Woods institutions, with little questions asked. Serbia will not get any substantial support, if any, because of its perceived links to Russia. So there's no even-handedness in treatment. That's pretty serious for an international organization. And what happens in practice is that all relevant countries make sure that they won't need balance of payment support for the IMF. Because if they do, they'll be subjected to doubtful conditionality, to put it mildly. And you may have a situation where the program of the IMF is used as a wedge to interfere with politics, with economic policy in ways that may not be suited to the national interest.
So on balance, do you think the IMF, in its entire history has been a positive force? Like, I realize that it's kind of politically oriented and I can appreciate the reality of that, but the countries that it has intervened with, has it done good or bad on balance?
It's difficult to answer your question because the IMF has been working since 1947. It has had programs with a lot of countries. I've seen programs, when I was there, I saw programs that were successful, even difficult ones, successful economically. But I've seen others that were disasters. So, for example, I would mention as programs that are successful, the one in Latvia, which was a difficult one. Now, as difficult programs or failed programs, I would point to Greece or to Ukraine, countries that were in dire difficulties and that gained a lot of support from the IMF, but did not manage to put their economic house in order despite the large support that they got from the IMF. In the case of Ukraine, it's clear. It's a country at war. In the case of Greece, there was a lot of difficulty for Greece to adapt to the rules of the euro area, and it nearly left the euro area, as you know.
So now Greece seems to have turned a corner of late. I was there in September and talked to the former, I guess, one of the members of the current labor minister, and maybe the impact of the IMF's intervention, maybe not so much the use of the money, but the thrust of the ideas of how to run the country took hold over time. I mean, it's possible, right? The IMF's involved in lots of discussions with policymakers who are coming in and out of government or just advising from the sidelines. So maybe that's the biggest role of the IMF, which is the advice, the generally good economic advice that it's providing.
No, I don't doubt that. I want to stress, I don't doubt the fact that you have a lot of competent people in the staff of the IMF. No doubt about that. It's a quite large staff. of basically economists, well-trained, and they do good jobs. I think the reports and the papers and the policy briefs that the IMF produces on a regular basis are a source of information, a source of analysis. What I'm trying to point out is that beyond this technical aspect, there's a political imbalance in the institution. So let me give you just one example.
Okay.
If you examine carefully the way the IMF over the years has analyzed Chinese economic policy, in particular exchange rate policy, you will detect, if you are balanced in your reading, you will detect a bias against China and a bias in favor of the views of the US Treasury. What is the US doing to this day, since my time there? I left the IMF in 2015. We're in 2026. What has the US been doing with respect to China? It continues to press China to allow its currency to appreciate. And China is very cautious about that. It's not willing to allow a big appreciation, and I can understand that. So you have all these calculations, which are technically debatable, let's say, about undervaluation of the Chinese currency. The Chinese simply do not listen to this because they look at their own national interest, and they don't need money from the IMF, as you know. So,
right.
so China is independent, and I as an economist, I always thought that there was a bias against the views of the Chinese authorities on this crucial issue. Remember going back very briefly on history to the 1980s, remember that the United States managed to regain ascendancy by pressuring, forcing Germany, and especially Japan, to allow substantial appreciation of their currencies with respect to the dollar. In other words, to allow a planned devaluation of the US dollar and recover competitiveness for the United States. Now, this was disastrous for Japan in particular. It opened an era of low growth after the financial crisis occurred. Now, China, I've been in touch with the Chinese officials for a long time now, and China is very careful in its examination of the economic policies of other countries. And I will tell you, China will not accept to follow Japan's route. China will not allow its policy on exchange rate and on any fundamental aspect of economic policy, for that matter, to be guided by the IMF's advice, by US views.
How financially secure do you feel? Imagine a tool to help you make smart financial decisions. A tool that factors in all your financial data and shows what you can safely spend every year for the rest of your life. That tool is Maxify. Powerful, accurate, and easy to use. Developed by Boston University economist Lawrence Kotlikoff, Maxify takes the guesswork out of financial decisions at every stage of life. Maxify calculates what you can afford to spend now and throughout retirement. And you can run what-if scenarios to see how your finances might change by taking a new job, buying a home, or downsizing. Knowing the impact before you decide lets you make smarter decisions so you can finally enjoy financial peace of mind. Are you ready? Visit Maxify.com today to start planning. That's Maxify with an I. Maxify, Maxify.com.
So let me just ask you on this. I've always wondered whether the exchange rate setting, the price level in both countries can adjust, and theoretically, a floating exchange rate versus a fixed exchange rate system should produce the same outcome if everything, is flexible in terms of markets. I presume you're thinking that that's not the case in the real world, that these exchange rate policies aren't offset by price level adjustments, so that the exchange rate is independent. Yeah.
Theoretically, your view is defensible, but neither the US or the IMF or the Chinese authorities believe that. They believe that Chinese actions, the US and the IMF, US Treasury, the IMF, believe that China's conscious, deliberate actions have been to allow a devaluation in real terms of the Chinese currency. External devaluation.
Well, let's assume that the real exchange rate really is affected by the relative, that China's made itself cheaper over the years in terms of its exports, that this view of China as just being very mercantilistic is the case. Do you think the West, Europe, and the U.S. and even other countries shouldn't be concerned about that in terms of income inequality in their own countries? I recall I was advising President Sanchez de Lozada in Bolivia about the pension reform going back, when he was still in office, and going to the airport and picking up a little toy truck for my son. Bolivia is like the poorest country in the Western Hemisphere, and it says on the bottom, "Made in China." And that just struck me that if anybody should be able to produce cheap toys, it should be the Bolivians at that point. But here they were selling Chinese-made toys. So does China, moving away from the IMF, does China pose a threat to, obviously we believe in comparative advantage. Obviously we're basically economists, so we believe in free trade. But on the other hand, we see expanding inequality in the US and presumably Europe. AI is part of that, robots are part of that, offshoring is part of that. Do you see the protectionism that's emerging as a reaction to China going too far in the direction, I mean, they're producing, think about the car industry, right? We're hardly producing regular cars in the US. We produce SUVs, but our industry is basically going away because of competition from abroad. I think that's, I'm not, I think we'd better to retrain people and move them out of the auto industry to the extent that's the efficient economic outcome. We shouldn't be paying like twice for electric cars what we can buy from China at this point. On the other hand, if China's going out of its way to get rid of our electric car, I mean, our automobile industry, and that, produces political upheaval in the US or reactionism, that also is tricky.
Now, you're right. I agree with you in large part. I'm not trying to say that Chinese success in terms of industry, in terms of international trade, is due only to exchange rate policy. There's been immense technological progress in China over the last decades. Their competitiveness is not spurious. It's guided by a plan, a development. Now, there are two questions here. One is the exchange rate, and the other is appreciation. You see, China is at a crossroads in my view, because as the Chinese currency becomes more prominent as a reserve currency gradually, and as the US dollar is threatened in that respect, there is a real risk that there will be excessive demand for Chinese currency. By that I mean a large inflow of capital, speculative short term, that would lead to an appreciation of the currency that the authorities might not welcome for the reasons that I gave you before. Now, what can China do? Let's say just for, I'm not predicting anything, but let's say you have a new major financial crisis in the United States. Will the dollar still be seen in that context as a safe haven currency? Perhaps no, not like in 2008 and in previous financial crises. Where will money move to? To gold more than it already has, and perhaps to the Chinese currency, also a bit to other Western developed country currencies. But China will receive probably a chunk of that. And how will the Chinese deal with that? They may allow appreciation, some appreciation, but if it goes too far, it will have to either lower interest rates, which may not be convenient from their domestic policy point of view, or intervene buying dollars. Now, buying dollars, that's what they have in excess and what they fear to hold because of the way that the US has weaponized its currency. So in the end, if that occurs, China might be led to impose capital controls at the entry. I'm just mentioning this as a scenario because it shows how complex the situation is for China. It's becoming increasingly important, and it's suffering the pangs of importance something it did not suffer 10 years ago, even less 20 years ago. So
Yeah.
I believe the Chinese are facing up to this challenge quite well, but it's a difficult one. They're struggling. And it's amazing to see, Larry, how the tables have turned. Until not very long ago, free trade was the centerpiece of the economic discourse of countries like the United States and Europe. Now it is the centerpiece of the discourse of China. And I understand you, the Americans, the Europeans, and the Brazilians. In that respect, we share your experience. We have deindustrialized at the hands of Chinese competitiveness. And I understand Trump's administration goal to contain the damage that Chinese exports do to the industrial base of the United States, including for security reasons, as I think he's also acknowledged publicly. No?
Yeah, I mean, the security is one thing, but I think, when we were at 30% of employment in manufacturing around 1950, we're now, I think under Biden, he started out with 8%. We're probably at 7% now. The idea that we're going to become a great manufacturing country that we can compete with China at this point, that horse is out of the stable. I think we have to think about improving the educational system in our country and looking a lot more like Switzerland, Sweden, Denmark in terms of they're able to, maintain a much more equal society and a fiscally sustainable society compared to what we're doing. I think just because of domestic policy so I think this idea that we should be blaming everything on China, I think that's just a scapegoat. And in general, let's just talk about Trump's policy, vis-a-vis Brazil, but also vis-a-vis other countries in terms of tariffs. How do you see Trump? How do you see what he just did with Venezuela? I just wrote a column about his narcissism, that it's time for everybody to be thinking about his mental health in a way that's a little different from what people have been pointing, which is whether or not he's awake or forgetful of things. But I think the narcissism is pretty clear if you compare his behavior with the actual definition of narcissism. I just wrote a column in my Substack on this. And I think narcissism can get worse. So I think every day he needs to be in the news to adore himself. And whatever he does, it's all about the news. So he could be screaming at the president of Colombia one day and the next day inviting him to the White House because that's changing the news, right? So it's, as I wrote in my piece, Louis XIV said, "L'état est moi," for the state is me. For Trump, it's les nouvelles, the news, c'est moi. The news is me. And tell us, give us your take on Trump's economic policy, on Trump's international military policy, on his failure to support Ukraine militarily. We're basically not providing any military support at this point compared to lots under Biden. His relationship with Russia. Give us your worldview, because you're very engaged internationally as well as domestically.
Look, I think we need to see Donald Trump in the context of a larger process, which is the relative decline of the United States and of the West more generally in the world. And the fact that the United States is not taking this lightly. The United States is resisting this relative decline. And with Trump, this resistance has come out into the open with a frankness, with a brutality that was not visible under previous American presidents, and not even under Trump 1, the first Trump administration. So Trump is very blatantly clear about his goal, which is to restore America's greatness. That's his slogan all the time. And I think he sees that to restore America's greatness, he needs to use force, military force including, threats, blackmail. And that's what he has been doing with tariffs, now with threats of intervention against Colombia, against Mexico, against Canada, against Greenland. Greenland is a crucial spot, perhaps, in terms of tension. So there's a lot of things about Trump that I really don't understand. You may know better than me. But just one thing that always amazes me, does it really make sense for the United States to be so aggressive and so humiliating even with respect to traditional allies like the Europeans? That's what he's doing all the time.
No, I think he's.
If his goal is to contain China, like Biden, I think he has that goal in mind. Is it useful to rupture relations or harm relations with Japan, with Europe, with Latin America, with the country?
No, it's bizarre behavior. I think it's sick. I think it's an indication of his mental illness that he's acting, going back to his entire career. It seems you don't act to screw over contractors. You don't try and make an agreement for somebody to do something, be an architect, design something, and then not pay them. Nobody acts this way. This is extreme, aberrant behavior. And I think the U.S., I've written with colleagues major large-scale simulation models, modeling of the relative position of countries through time, kind of the future of global economic power. And it's clear that the productivity growth that China is experiencing, even if you make conservative assumptions, that by the end of this century, China will be about a third of the world economy. The U.S. will be about 10, 11% of the world economy. India will be perhaps 10% of the world economy. So China and India together will be about 40 to 50% of the world economy. We can't stop that. We can't stop that with tariffs. We can't stop that with whatever. We have to accept that. But at the moment, it's hardly the case that the U.S. is being eclipsed by China. I mean, our GDP per capita growth has been quite good. Hasn't been as good as it was in the last century, but it's been reasonable. We've got more inequality, yes, but through that process. But the basic share of GDP in the world economy of the U.S. has been stable, around 20, 25%, depending on how you measure it. So this paranoia seems to me to be partly politically motivated. Let's blame, we've got increasing inequality, a lot of disgruntled middle class and low wage and middle wage workers who are not making progress, and let's blame it on China.
Want more money, less risk, and a better life? Buy Money Magic, a new book by Lawrence Kotlikoff, Boston University economist, personal finance expert, and best-selling author. Whether it's education, career, marriage, housing, investing, retirement, Social Security, IRA, or 401k decisions, Money Magic delivers scores of secrets to raise your living standard. Financial journalist Jane Bryant Quinn says Money Magic is a must-read. Nobel laureate George Akerlof says Money Magic is quite probably the best financial advice book ever written. Financial guru John Malden says, you'll love this amazing book. It's full of wit, wisdom, and startling paths to a better financial life. And columnist Scott Burns calls Money Magic a funny, brilliant read, offering wildly powerful, unconventional choices that can literally change your life. Get Lawrence Kotlikoff's Money Magic today at Amazon, Barnes & Noble, and independent booksellers.
But what I noticed is that there's a bipartisan hostility to China. Democrats, Republicans are always speaking of containing China, not only speaking, but taking measures, even before Trump came in. Now, Trump has perhaps changed the strategy. I agree with you that mental health is an issue there for the US president. But to quote that line from Hamlet, there seems to be some method in his madness. Because if you look at the National Security Strategy document, it lays out in a pretty clear way what his stance will be. And in fact, the attack on Venezuela confirms entirely parts of the document. especially the one that relates to the Western Hemisphere. He has invoked Monroe Doctrine in a completely different setting from the original Monroe Doctrine. To do what? To claim a preeminence. That's the word used repeatedly in the national security strategy. He's more recently spoken about dominance, not throughout the entire hemisphere, Western Hemisphere, including Central America, Caribbean, South America, and Greenland is part of the Western Hemisphere. So he's being consistent. I think sometimes people underestimate it. I'm not sure it's true that his bark is worse than his bite. His bite has been quite important. This attack on Venezuela, let me tell you, Larry, it's a major wake-up call for Latin America as a whole, for Europe concerning Greenland. And the issue is, why is he doing this? Why is he trying to treat us, Latin Americans, as population in his backyard? I think he believes
He's a slave, so to speak.
I think he believes that the only way to regain world hegemony, make America great again on a world scale, is to accumulate forces by dominating the Western Hemisphere, and then in a subsequent stage, moving against China, and perhaps trying to split a little bit Russia from China. That looks, it's a conjecture, but I think it's a reasonable conjecture.
So I agree with everything you said, but I don't understand what moving against China could possibly. We can't stop China. China could live without any exports or imports and grow on its own because it's such a big population. Even with the demographics, even with its declining population of about 400 million by the end of the century, it's going to be a huge part of the world GDP, with or without international trade. So, and militarily, it's going to be equal or superior to the U.S. in terms of, and we're never going to be able to fight that war because it will end up as nuclear, shootout, and everybody will end up dead. So I don't see that there's any end game here in terms of maintaining the world position of the U.S. I just think it's folly. I think it's sickness.
The way you portray it is the way we would like to see the U.S. behaving. You know, the U.S. will remain in the foreseeable future one of the major countries of the world, but it will no longer be the world hegemonic force. You know? And can the U.S. accept that? Because I wonder if the way you put it just now, if it's representative of the way U.S. policy elites think about the world.
No, I think we have morons. We have a moron running the country, and we have morons that he appointed. So we don't have people that have any, if you asked Stephen Miller to project forward without any changes in, let's say, any changes in policy where China would be at the end of the century compared to the U.S., he wouldn't know because he hasn't studied. It's not that these people are trained as economists, that they've studied anything. We have them trying to out crazy Trump in order to normalize him, as far as I can tell. There's only a couple of grown-ups in that entire administration. And
would you include in that group of adults, would you include Steve Mirren?
Steve Mirren, well, he was a former student of mine, actually.
Oh, yeah?
Yeah, he was an undergraduate, went off to Harvard. And I think there's a lot of people with chips on their shoulder about Harvard and elite colleges, just as a kind of a side statement. Probably Trump didn't get in, or his son didn't get in to Harvard. Stephen didn't have a great time as a grad. He did get a PhD, a very smart kid, got a PhD at Harvard, but I didn't think he was left with a chip on his shoulder about how he was being treated at Harvard and didn't get the academic position he wanted. I think there's a lot of people in this administration with that background. And Stephen came up with this idea of taxing. It's a crazy, stupid idea of let's partially default on foreigners holding U.S. debt in order to make some money. I mean, this would kill us economically and kill us as exactly short-term, penny-wise, dollar foolish, dollar really stupid thinking. So I like Stephen as a person, but some of what he's been doing or saying is exactly the opposite of what I think is appropriate. But the whole group of, the national security, the whole group there in Washington, Miller, Navarro, Christie Nome, it just goes on and on. You have people that don't have the qualifications to be running the jobs that they're running. They're just not grown-ups.
I mentioned Mirren for a reason. If you try to understand whatever logic, if there is a logic in the Trump administration's policies and moves, you cannot base yourself on the president's posts on Truth Social or on impromptu interviews he gives practically every day, sometimes more than once a day. You have to look at some documents. The only ones I sort of found useful in putting together what's going on were Steve Mirren's papers, the speech he gave shortly after Trump's inauguration, and the paper he prepared last year I think it was for Hudson Institute. That's one. And the second source is the national security strategy, which seems to be consistent with what Trump is doing before and after its publication. So that's why I mentioned your former student. I didn't know you had him as a student. But anyway, I think we're in a bad spot here because the US is a very powerful country. It may be in decline in relative terms. I think it is, but it's still super powerful. It's a rogue superpower, I would say, and capable of doing immense damage. Can you imagine the effect this attack on Venezuela? By the way, to be fair to him, a very successful operation. This made a big impression in the whole of Latin America and concerned us everywhere. I wouldn't be surprised if countries all over the world start increasing their military preparedness in light of the sort of world that the US as a rogue superpower is establishing, see?
It might be, I don't know the degree to which Madero was actually involved in the drug trade. There's been no presentation of here's concrete evidence, no build up to this. It's just, we're going to send the fleet, and then allegations about Madero, which were probably, let's assume they're right. And let's assume he takes out a drug lord. Does that mean there's not going to be another one there tomorrow? My recommendation for who should run Venezuela is that we should send Stephen Miller there as the ambassador and see how eager he is to go there. Since we're running the country, he should go there and he'll be the boots on the ground, but he'll also be the biggest target on the ground. And this is what I'm sure the heads of the energy companies are thinking. I don't want to go set foot in Caracas. I could likely be shot. There are lots of people. So, it's a demonstration maybe that has the effect of saying to presidents and leaders in different parts of South America, if you get in bed with the drug cartels, expect to be taken out. But I'm not sure we can do that on a routine basis without, I think there's going to be, from this as well as prior policy, a movement to boycott the US. There's already kind of a partial movement, certainly in Canada. A third of the tourists that were coming to the US for like summering in Florida, they're not coming. The bookings, the plane bookings are down a third. That could happen globally. There could be just a boycott the US movement globally as a result of reaction to Trump's being so repugnant in terms of what he says, how he says it, and what he's doing.
No, I think that's happening already. But let me tell you, these accusations against Nicolas Maduro don't look very solid, very credible. And you have noticed, of course, that Trump has dropped these accusations as a major reason for acting against Venezuela or intervening in Venezuela. He's now speaking of natural resources, of taking the oil that belongs to us. So I would compare the intervention in Venezuela in some respects with the intervention in Iraq to topple Saddam Hussein. there you remember there was this allegation later. Later, it became known that it was completely unfounded. That Saddam Hussein had chemical weapons and weapons of mass destruction, and this turned out not to be true. It turned out to be a pretext. I think the real reason for the intervention is to, take out a leader of a country that was opposed to the United States strategically, and to get a hold on the natural resources of the country. But Larry, look at how Trump actually is behaving. He acts forcefully in several moments, but he's also full of bluff. When he says he's running Venezuela, it's not true. Kidnapped the president, but the regime is still there. The Bolivarian regime established by Hugo Chavez is still there. It's, of course, under immense pressure, under blockade, and threatened by new strikes, and prone to try to reach some sort of agreement with the United States. But regime change has not happened. And to effect regime change, probably the US would need to be willing to put boots on the ground in a major way. Because Venezuela is not Grenada. Venezuela is not Dominican Republic even, It's a large.
And it's not even Iraq. It's probably militarily more capable to resist us than Iraq. I don't know.
Yeah, I don't know really, but there's a lot of talk about the way that the population of Venezuela is armed and is loyal to the government. Another thing, look at the way things are misrepresented. I'm no fan of Nicolas Maduro. I don't know much about him, to be honest. But I noticed that the Western media, and the Brazilian media too, portrayed him as a dictator with little support. Remember the statements made by Maria Corina Machado that the election had been won by her candidate by 70% of the votes. Where is this support? It's not there. So much so that Trump had to be frank about it. Look, I don't believe Maria Corina Machado can be the leader of the country. She has no support. She has no respect in Venezuela. He said that. So a lot of things that are said about Venezuela are distorted because, look, I'm amazed to see how the media in Europe, how the media in the US, and how the media in Brazil, because the media in Brazil is largely reference to the media of the United States. There's an operation that brainwashes people in a major way. We complain about fake news in the internet, but fake news in the media, in the main media, is there as well.
Yeah.
It's very difficult to find out what's really going on.
Yeah, but I think the reality is that running Venezuela would require a whole different political mindset inside the country, and the reaction probably to what just happened is probably as anti-American as possible. And so he's doing things that are that are just first order stupid because, you just think about the next day, how the people of Venezuela are going to react. They're going to react that this is the gringo is coming back again, and this is our country. And if anybody steps foot, we're going to take them out, short of having an entire army there. And it's just not worth it to the US. What would be worth it to the US is actually defending Europe. I mean, that's what made us powerful is our alliances with Europe, right? And getting back and assisting Ukraine in a real concrete way. That would be sensible. So part of me thinks that Trump is actually, some days I think that he's just mentally ill. Some days I think he's a Russian agent, Russian asset. And that because everything I see him doing is efforts to undermine the U.S. government, U.S. country, the country, in kind of all respects, rule of law, education, science, and then think about rare earths. He puts all these tariffs on China. We're getting 90% of our rare earth minerals from China, and then he starts backtracking because he realizes that we're not going to be able to make batteries. So it's like the guy is either not thinking ahead or intentionally trying to sabotage us as a country. What do you think?
Well, you know better than me about your country, but from outside, I would say that that Trump is perhaps what could be characterized as a hyper-imperialist. He wants to restore America's greatness. He said that several times, and he believes that he is restoring America's greatness to its
But let me
freedom.
just stop you on that. Just because the term greatness, if you said, how do you define greatness? If you think about it as the share of GDP in the world, we're as great as we've ever been in recent decades. We're about some measures 25% of world GDP. Now, after World War II, it was 50%, but obviously Japan and Europe recovered.
Yeah.
So where is this loss of greatness?
Well,
Maybe
you see,
our ability to manufacture stuff has gone down or whatever. We lost greatness in the car production, but
no, you've lost greatness in industrial sectors that are vital for national defense, for national aggression, if you want.
but
And so,
that doesn't require these policies. That just requires investment in national defense and being nice to China so we get enough of the rare earth minerals to produce the weapons that we need. I don't see the argument to begin with that we're not great.
you see, the U.S. has become unaccustomed to a polycentric world. After the Soviet Union collapsed, you had a period of about 15 years, the unipolar moment, which is very recent. This has carried over into the mindset of the American elites, policy elites. I don't believe it's true of the country as a whole. I suppose that the country as a whole has little interest in this outlook. But there's this feeling that America needs to be number one. I agree with you that America can no longer be at number one as it used to be, for many reasons, some of which you have outlined. But is it not true that a large part of the policy elite would support an attempt to sustain America's relative power, including by violence? You see, look at what Trump has announced for Venezuela. He has said that all proceeds of Venezuelan export of oil will be necessarily deposited in U.S. accounts, and that this money can only be used to import from the United States. And he has said, I want to reduce the presence of China and Russia in Venezuela, including through the blockade. So this amounts to what? This amounts to a restoration of colonial power, the relationship between the metropolis and the colony,
Yeah.
closing ports for other countries. He's very regressive from a historical point of view in his stance. But why does he do that? Because he's not confident that at this present stage, the United States can compete with China on an equal basis. It needs to use some other methods, even non-economic, tariffs and military action.
Question: how financially secure do you feel? Do you have enough money to retire? How much is enough? And if you don't have enough, how can you possibly find that money before you retire? Tough questions. One smart answer: Maxify. Maxify is the powerful online planning tool that takes the guesswork out of retirement. Maxify compares your assets against your fixed expenses to calculate how much you can safely spend every year for the rest of your life. And it shows you safe ways to find more money. Developed by Boston University economist Lawrence Kotlikoff, Maxify makes a complicated problem like retirement planning simple. Maxify. Powerful, accurate, easy to use. Want some peace of mind? Make the smart choice. Maxify. Visit Maxify.com today to start planning. That's Maxify with an I. Maxify. Maxify.com.
I mean, it's true that we can't compete in making leaf blowers. I've got a terrific $80 leaf blower made in China. It would probably cost $400 to have it made in the US. We're never going to be able to compete on leaf blowers, but the U.S. GDP per capita and as share of world GDP is terrifically high compared to China. And so in no sense are we kind of losing ground to China in the short run. In the long run, militarily, we're probably losing some ground because they're producing a fleet at a faster pace than we are, but maybe the quality of our smaller fleet is higher than theirs. There's just no evidence here of any loss of greatness compared to 15 years ago. So I think the whole thing is pretense. I think it's all, let's, tell the story and then let's just stay in the news. And yes, it is a return to colonialism, but is that actually going to increase or just what we're going to just waste resources like we did in Iraq, like we did in Afghanistan, like we did in Vietnam? And we've
Yeah.
been involved in, I think, 150 coups or over the course of our history, interventions. It's like every year or two that we're intervening in some country. I don't think that's made us great. I think it's just cost us.
Actually, I think you can argue that the policies that are being pursued by Trump, instead of making America great again, as he says, will make America weaker.
Oh, everything. Yeah.
The way we see America from here has deteriorated enormously. Average Brazilians that were never hostile to the United States are becoming hostile
yeah.
because of the way he behaves with respect to a neighbor country, you know. You can throw propaganda at the Brazilian public, but this propaganda becomes thinner and thinner as the U.S. radicalizes its stance. You know, one of the great things about America, let me put it the other way, one of the great aspects of American power in the world was soft power. Trump is squandering soft power in a major way. I can tell you, you may not believe this, but as a Latin American, as a Brazilian, American soft power here in the last decades, since World War II, has been enormous, enormous. And now the US is destroying this asset
Yeah.
in a major way.
I think we're going to just start. I think the world is going to respond with a boycott. I think a complete boycott. People won't come. They may. I remember during Vietnam, there were major anti-American demonstrations throughout the world during Vietnam. And at some level, rightfully so. We were conducting a war. We killed probably 1 million or so Vietnamese for no particularly good reason. We made it up that they're going to become a communist country and our enemy, and therefore we had to uh, get rid of this South Vietnamese president and install a different one and fight this war. And it was hopeless. And in the end, basically the day after the war ends, and we basically leave in disgrace in the sense that we had to fly our people from our embassy out on a helicopter from the roof of the embassy. If you recall, the day, pretty much the day after, a couple of years later, we're doing business with them, commerce, and that's continuing. So, okay, so their government is not a democracy like we would like, perhaps, or some of us would like, but ours is not a great democracy either when you have somebody declaring that an election was stolen and attacking the Congress to try and, in effect, stage a domestic coup. So, yeah.
Outside the United States, a lot of people are asking, what kind of political opposition will Trump face in the United States? Is he popular? Is he losing popularity? How does he look for the midterm elections? Because there are a lot of people, I'm included in that, hoping that he will face more intense domestic political opposition. I'm not sure if that's already the case, but I'm not sure, for example, if these military adventures can in some way stimulate support for him. I hope not.
I don't think so. Yeah.
Well, good to hear that. So let's hope that the United States will defend its constitution, its legal structure, its freedom of speech,
Yeah.
academic freedom. All this is under threat, as you know better than I do.
I think what we need to tell you just, I've been thinking about this too. I think what's needed is a billionaire who's very charismatic, very reasonable, to start a third party and have one candidate himself, two candidates, himself or herself, and a vice president. And the vice presidential candidate should be a former military official, like head of a Joint Chiefs of Staff. And that party should run against, in the presidential election, should announce we're running this ticket. And that will mean that Trump will have to, he can't direct all his attention to the Democrats. And it's easy to criticize the Democrats because they have a lot of people on the far left who make extreme, ridiculous statements about what we should be doing. So they're easy targets. But somebody who's middle of the road, sensible, and can take down Trump in terms of the actions he's been engaged in and the statements he's been making and what he's been doing to democracy, that would be effective. And then every statement that Trump makes every day, there'd be somebody to respond to it. That could change the dynamic here. And we would see, I think, his whole movement fall apart. And either that person would get elected or the Democrats would put somebody much more moderate in there to compete, and that person could then throw support to the Democrats if it turned out that that was what was needed to defeat J.D. Vance or whoever's appointed.
Mm-hmm.
These people are not making friends among even their MAGA supporters. I mean, we have this woman in Minneapolis. I don't want to keep you too long, but here we have ICE coming into Minneapolis to arrest illegal immigrants. And the notion is here that's what's being portrayed is that this is a much bigger crackdown on illegal immigrants, much larger deportations than we've had in the past under Biden. That's not the case. Trump's deportations in 2025 are somewhat lower, or maybe the same number as Biden's were in his last year, and even lower than what Obama was doing when he was in office. Now, he has closed the border, and I applaud him for that because I think that was necessary, and the Democratic president should have done that. But here we have him visibly, for political reasons perhaps or whatever, to be able to talk about it on the press, sending ICE into this city, and then they shoot this woman who's trying to clearly get out of the way and has her wheels turned to the right. And there's an officer who then shoots her on the pretense that she was trying to attack him with a car. And if she would have had the wheels turned to the left. So it's obvious to the public when they look at the videos that this is just a lie. In other words, the propaganda, the immediate statement of Trump was, this was a terrorist. This is a mother with 3 kids, okay? A nice lady. And she was being nice to the people on the video, the nice people say, and reasonably nice. It's just, so I think that people are going to get increasingly fed up. His poll numbers are dropping, or his approval rating is dropping, let's put it that way. So anyway, I have some hope that there are ways for things to proceed, but it's going to take, I think, somebody who's got lots of money, can get on the ballot in all the states, sets a party, has no primary, just runs himself with a top military VP, and that would just be like a Macron situation in the US, and that could turn the tide.
Well, let's see how that unfolds. We're all focusing on the United States as never before because the future of the planet, and of Latin America in particular, hinges largely on the way this will play out in Venezuela, inside the United States, and in the relations between the United States and Europe, for example. So we can perhaps come back to these topics.
Absolutely. Love to have you back.
Throughout the year. If you have time and interest, I'll be ready to come back on all these issues with new information.
Okay, great. Thanks, Paulo. I really appreciate it. This was a lot of fun and great to meet you.
It's great to be here. Thank you for the invitation again.
Bye-bye.
Bye.